33 and 34, and to John chapter 10. So last week we left out, we were talking about these shepherds that had the care of God's people in the Old Testament. And we saw basically how they failed at their job. Well, it helps if you put the stick in, doesn't it? These new technologies, not reading my mind. There we go. And we talked about their failure in the watchman responsibility, which are the main thrust of the passages that are on there now. But what other things did God mention as their failures? Do you remember? Too early. Well, remember he talked about the fact that they had fed on the flock. They had failed to bind their wounds, to seek after the lost ones, as well as this passage we were looking at in closing. And so that was the passage in Acts we referenced a few times in Acts chapter 20. So here is God talking about the ideal shepherd in 34, 11, and 12. So, for thus says the Lord God, behold, I myself, note that, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out. As a shepherd cares for his herd in the day when he is among his scattered sheep, so I will care for my sheep and will deliver them from all the places to which they were scattered on a cloudy and gloomy day. Then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them. He will feed them himself and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. So here is the Lord talking about a couple of different things in response to their failures as shepherds, as leaders. Number one, what does he say he's going to do? He's going to do it himself. Okay? You guys failed. You did it miserably. And I'm going to come and I'm going to do it right. And then he specifically mentions a name. Whose name is that? David. What's out of place about that? I don't trust you to stick to it.
No, when he talks about David, when Christ said all those things of the Old Testament have to be fulfilled, and what was mentioned in the Psalm, what David mentioned. So Christ is a fulfillment of what David is going to say.
But see, you did do it.
What?
The question was, what is out of place about the name David there? You gave the explanation, not what is out of place. What is out of place is that name David. Why?
Because they haven't set up a king yet, a kingdom.
They've already had the kingdom. Ezekiel is one of the captivity prophets, if you will. A good way to try and cross-reference him. So David has already reigned. Solomon's already reigned. All these things had already happened and led to the situation Israel is in at that time. Because of those shepherds, because of the poor leadership. Yeah. So God mentions David here, and this is why all of these prophecies that refer to David, post-David, are God's way of prophetically referring to Christ. If we go to Acts chapter 2, when Peter is giving that great sermon to them there, we know verses 38 and so, but the whole chapter is a brilliant, inspired piece of preaching. But he has been talking about David, and he says in verse 29 there, "Brethren, may I confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us this day." And if you know your geography there, you could point to David's tomb from where Peter was. And I suspect he did that. Yeah. But there was no one there who did not recognize the fact that David was deceased, and yet they had these prophecies that mentioned David, and they had come to associate the Messiah with David for those reasons. That is why the New Testament starts out with that lineage, to show us that Christ is a descendant of David. So to establish that he is the heir to that throne that was prophesied. So he says he died, he was buried with us, his tomb is with us. And so because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. So Peter, in the course of showing that Jesus was the promised Messiah, had to connect him to those prophecies about David, including the one he has cited here, which is David's own about not allowing his flesh to decay and everything. Peter says obviously he wasn't talking about himself physically, because he's over there in the tomb, but he was talking about one. Do you remember when they were, one occasion when they're trying to test Jesus, and Jesus said to them, "What do you say, the Son of Man, whose son is he?" And they said, "Oh, he's the son of David." That's somewhere in Matthew 10. They said, "Oh, he's the son of David." And Jesus said in response to them, "If he's the son of David, why does David call him Lord?" And he stumped them there. He made them realize, you see, that in looking for simply a physical descendant of David, they were on the wrong track, and they should know that. They should understand that just simply a physical descendant of David could not meet all of those prophecies, could not have been addressed by David as Lord. So as we get into to John chapter 10, we're going to look, and I'm just going to, rather than paging through there, I'm just going to use my Bible. But John chapter 10. What comes before John chapter 10? Boy, this is the best class I have ever taught. You guys are sharp. John chapter 9 does come before John chapter 10. What happens in John chapter 9? See, we're making the degree of difficulty going up just a little. The man born blind, notice this. Yeah. So, Jesus heals the man that was born blind. What were the details about that man? He was blind from birth. Everybody there knew him personally. They were used to seeing him begging. They knew the family. It's just like someone having a handicapped child in your neighborhood. maybe not quite as much in our current culture, but in past times when everybody knew their neighbors and knew them well. And everybody knew who this was. So when Jesus healed him, there was absolutely no denying that a miracle had been done. So therefore, the Jewish religious leaders, these elders, you see, these leaders of the people, they have an issue because they're trying to turn the people away from Jesus, and yet Jesus has healed the eyes of the blind. And remember, at that point, the word used about this man, he had to have been, around 40 probably. So he wasn't, blind for just a few years. He was blind for decades. They all knew it. And the explanation given by those Pharisees led to this little concluding scene, because John chapter 10 does not create a break. Well, it creates a break, but it's a false break. John chapter 10 is not a break in the narrative. They chose to do it that way. But John chapter 10 begins with truly, truly. Truly, truly never starts a speech. It's always part of, as we see it here. So it's what happened at the end. If you go back to, as Patty said, where Jesus affirms his deity in John 9:35. Jesus heard that they put him out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." He knew that Jesus had to be telling the truth, because Jesus had worked a miracle like nobody had ever in the history of the earth, and that could only come from God. So he had to be a truth teller. So he worships him. And then Jesus says in verse 39, "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see." Oh, we can understand that. There's that physical blind guy right there. Just to go. "And that those who see may become blind." Well, you see, the Pharisees are there too. They're always hanging around in the background at the least. And they say, those of the Pharisees who were with him heard him. And they said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" They knew when he said that, you see, that this was some kind of veiled reference to them. They may not be exactly sure what the insult is, but they know he is somehow calling them blind. And Jesus says to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains." So they claim to have the truth. They claim to be God's leaders. They didn't see the truth at all, though. And so that brings in the parable, basically, of the Good Shepherd. Then he says, "Truly, truly." What did we learn in our Wednesday night class?
Absolutely.
It's an absolute truth. It's the strongest statement that Jesus can make to say this is truth. "I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber." You see, the audience here is those Pharisees who just said, "We're not blind, are we?" So he's going to show them their failure, basically, by comparison with himself. And he's going to use something from their everyday life, and that is a shepherd. While they're not all shepherds, they're all very familiar with shepherds. What's more, the shepherd imagery for God, as we just read in Ezekiel, for example, runs all through the Old Testament. How does Psalm 23 begin? "The Lord is my shepherd." So there are a number of Psalms that talk about. So just in the Psalms, you have numerous references to God as the shepherd and everything. So in their culture, they recognize a shepherd, they know the shepherd's life, and they have some familiarity with the imagery already. So he's using something that should work because they really understand this. The problem, of course, is that's no longer true, that we all understand a lot about sheep herding. Yeah. So I'm sure through the years, for those of you who have been Christians a long time, you've probably heard some explanations or some attempts, but for example, when he talks about this fold of the sheep, what are we talking about? Sorry. For those of us who have any kind of joint pain, today is a terrible day. The weather is chilly. I couldn't even get my wedding ring on this morning. I tried at 3 different time periods, thinking the swelling would go down a little bit. But y'all don't tell Debbie I didn't have it on today. So, let's go back to verse 1. He who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep. So y'all are correct in talking about the flock and everything. But the fold itself is basically a sheep pen. Okay? It was usually just a little rough hut, often not completely finished. In other words, it may have just half a roof or whatever the case may be. A lot of times, if there was a suitable cave in the area, they would use a cave to be it. But this, again, is something that's common to them. He who does not enter by the door into the fold climbs up some other way is a thief and a robber. That's 2 different things. It's easy to read that as one thing. But you see that word and a robber. He's saying 2 things about people that don't come in through the legitimate door. Number 1, they're thieves. That in the Greek word denotes basically cunning, trickery. So they get in by deceit or something like that. Think of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay? Robbery is a Greek word that denotes violence. So think of someone clubbing the doorman and getting inside, But that is the difference in those terms. So one way to tell whether someone is the legitimate shepherd or not, how did he get into the fold? If he didn't come through the true door, then he's a thief and a robber. He who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him, the doorkeeper opens. Now you can read lots of explanations of the doorkeeper here. I think that it's one of those inert factors, just like the fold, for example. The pen itself, it's just a detail of the paragraph that doesn't have an exact application. And maybe my proof of that is the fact that there are so many different explanations as to what it is. That tells you that in reality, we don't know. And I think we don't know because it doesn't have one. It's just part of the story. If I were to assign it something, I would say the doorkeeper includes everything that God has done in his providence. And think of Galatians 4:4 here again. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. Everything that God did to make it the right time for the Messiah to come into the world. So to him the doorkeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. I missed that detail for a while growing up. And it's easy to do, but he calls his sheep by name. They shared these sheepfolds with other shepherds in the area. So in a sheepfold, you would have a lot of sheep. Not all of them would be part of flock A, shall we say, okay? And the way the shepherds sorted the sheep each day, they didn't have to go through and physically ID them or look for brands like we do on cattle or anything like that. You know, they literally called to the sheep. And the sheep knew their shepherd's voice. And so they would respond to that voice. And that is one of the biggest keys to all of this, is understanding that principle. Jesus is taking this analogy of this mixed flock. The shepherds come in the morning. They're ready to call their sheep out. And they sort them simply by calling to them. And I have seen videos of this, by the way. So if you want to go on YouTube later, you can do that. You can see this. But the sheep will not go to the wrong shepherd. So that's what he's talking about. To him, the doorkeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name. Love that individuality. Yeah.
Could the doorkeeper be in reference to Christ or God?
Well, Christ is going to be the door itself in just a minute. But here I think it's just that, like I said, I just think it's an inner detail like the hut or the cave itself of the parable. So he,
It sounds like doorkeeper sounds like a person.
yes, because in their culture it would have been a person. By name, and leads them out. The shepherds don't go into the fold and grab hold of the scruff of the neck of the sheep and start throwing them out. One of the big problems when people try and modernize this parable a little bit and use the old cowboy and cattle imagery is that you drive cattle. You have to get behind, and believe me, you know, we got a cow farm in the family. You have to drive those cows. They are lazy creatures and they don't want to go the right way. You don't drive sheep. What do you do with sheep? You lead them. So what does that mean? Remember the joke I told last Sunday about the guy coming up 10 minutes after the group had passed, all out of breath, and saying, have you seen a group of people go by? I'm their leader. Now, you're not their leader. You may have that title, but you're not their leader. Yeah. Shepherds know the sheep. They call them, we'll emphasize some of these in closing this morning, but that they call them a stranger. They simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. What applications can we make of that? I couldn't hear that. Don't listen to false teachers. How do I know? See, that's the key question. Very few people say, I think I want to go listen to a false teacher today. Give me some unhealthy doctrine. Chase?
So in this case, it says that the sheep listen to his voice. So I think of it as those sheep have to study and have to know the voice. So that's where you watch out for the false teaching.
Those sheep have learned the shepherd's voice. They've learned his voice through time and experience. What do you hear me say all the time? That we spend way too much time these days reading each other's books we've written and not enough time in the actual Word of God. It's a question of whose voice you listen to. Israel as a whole was led greatly astray, but part of that responsibility was their own because they accepted the false interpretations that their leaders gave them of who the Messiah would be and etc. and what counted as holiness and righteousness and all of these things. So there is a huge aspect of this parable that is focused in on the fact that, one, the shepherd knows the sheep, and two, the sheep know the shepherd. And to hear Jesus' voice among all the voices clamoring. And this is another aspect I think we miss out on a little bit, but in this time period, especially following the death of Herod the Great, but in that time period of when they come back from the captivity, they had so many false messiahs pop up. I mean, they were popping up like Starbucks. There would be one in every area, every year, and that individual would convince a group of people that he was indeed the Messiah. And that group of people, would then begin following him, and there were some disastrous results as a result of that. If you'll remember when the Sanhedrin is debating about what to do with the apostles. They got the apostles in prison. The apostles have got Jerusalem in an uproar, teaching this new doctrine about Jesus and the resurrection. And they're like, what do we do? And you remember Gamaliel rises up, one of their most famous rabbis of all time, and definitely the top living rabbi of that time. He stands up and addresses them and says, be careful what you do here, because false messiahs have popped up in our lifetime. And he named some. That was, right then in that generation. And he says, their followers get killed. They get destroyed. And if this thing is speaking of Christianity, if it's of men, it will die out too. But if it's of God, and then you go against him, you're fighting against God. So this problem of false messiahs and knowing the true voice, this is something that was very real then. It's very real to us now because of the abundance of false teachers today. But it was very real to them in that day, and not just with the Jewish leaders teaching them false things, but also with messiahs calling up and say, come follow me. And then of course you have verse 6, this figure of speech. So this is a divine acknowledgement of the fact that is a parable, and not every part of it has meaning. It's a story to teach something you don't understand. This figure of speech, Jesus spoke to them, and everybody got it. No, that's not what happened.
It says they did not understand.
Oh, they did not understand what those things were, which he had been saying to them. What did they just prove? They don't know his voice. That was their problem. They spent their time debating the different rabbis' positions on Scripture. That's what you learned as a kid, and when you debated interpretations, you didn't go so much from the passage as it was this rabbi in this generation said this, and this rabbi agreed with him, and this rabbi agreed with, that they have been listening to the wrong voice and they can't recognize his voice. So Jesus said to them again, all right, now he's coming back, guys. He's coming back. You still don't get it. Let me try again. Truly, truly. You see how that never, it's always part of an ongoing narrative. I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. What happens at night? And this may be something we don't know culturally. What happens at night when the sheep are taken back to the fold? Before they're closed up, two things happen. They're numbered. Got to make sure they're all there, right? They're numbered, and there's something else. They're inspected. Each one individually by their shepherd. They're inspected to make sure they didn't get cut or injured in some way that day. You see? And if they find a cut, then they, would anoint it with oil, clean it out, wrap it up, whatever was needed. So when God in Ezekiel 33 and 34 talking about how they didn't bind the wounds and everything, that's what he's referring to. The good shepherd, he is going to do that, and he's going to do that each night as they come in the door. So if anyone enters through me, he will be saved. I missed verse 8, didn't I? All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. So he's talking about the true Israel, if you will. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. So here is Jesus picturing himself, and it is true. It's not as true as some biblical commentators would make you think. It's not always the case. But it is true that often the sheepfold had no physical door. And the shepherds would lie across the threshold. And they would be literally the door in that way. They're lying across, they're making sure that no predator gets in, no sheep goes out during the night. So this is the reference he's making to them now. This should, of course, scream at us in the New Testament era about the need to obey the gospel of Christ. And be baptized into his body, into his fold, into his flock. But look at verse 10. The thief comes only to kill and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Thought we'd get further than that today, but I see we're about to run out of time. I come that they might have life in him. The shepherds, the false shepherds, profit only themselves. The whole main thrust of the shepherd imagery is just this, that the shepherd cares about the welfare of the sheep, that is his priority, the well-being of the sheep. So the lives that were, the average lives they were living in their culture under their leaders, with all those burdens that they had made that they wouldn't move with their own little finger and these things. It was a strenuous life just in trying to follow them. And then the way they would swap the sacrifices when you go to sacrifice and sell. You'd have to buy their animal for 10 times as much. And all of these things, you see, or their abuse of the flock. But a genuine shepherd is concerned about the welfare of the flock. He does want us to live joyous lives. But the most joy is to be found in following Him, because He created this world for us to enjoy. And you know, sometimes we go light on that, trying not to mislead anyone into that health and wealth doctrine. But He did create this world for us to enjoy. The things that He has laid down for us and the principles to live by, they bring the best life. Not the playboy, not the hedonistic lifestyle, any of those things, but following God in sincerity and in truth, loving others, treating others as you would have them treat you. That brings the best life, even in this world. All right, class dismissed.